Secretary Raimondo's email was really illuminating. So they penetrated a number of government email exchanges, using a 0-day that they found, listened to a whole bunch of, read a whole bunch of emails as these people were beginning to go, as these government officials were preparing for a trip, Secretary Raimondo to China. So they're observing the emails of the U.S. ambassador to China, the senior State Department officials for Asia, and the Secretary of Commerce. So they knew our negotiating points before we showed up. And I said to somebody, I was on TV, and I said, kind of made the, the insight that, this it's a big deal. They're willing to sacrifice, they're willing to, use a 0-day on this, so that they could get this big advantage. And when I got off the show, a friend of mine called me and said, hey, who'd watched the TV hit, says, you got this exactly wrong. What's really scary about this is that the Chinese must have so many 0 days that they're willing to expend one on just getting a couple weeks of access to one of our senior persons, unclassified email accounts. And that's another way to look at it. Like, they were willing to burn a 0-day on this. Probably means they got a lot more 0 days. And that should really worry us about their ability to penetrate our systems. So from my perspective, we have a really challenging adversary there. And I'm really right now only talking about the nation state. I haven't begun to mention criminal actors, and we could talk about that in a bit. But so when you ask how the government looks at this, they understand they have this threat. They understand that we have these vulnerabilities. I don't think they have a complete understanding of the vulnerabilities, but we need to begin this. The government is trying to study our vulnerabilities. And they're doing it by critical infrastructure area, by types of threats, what type of cyber malicious activity and such, and by adversary, and then build themselves a strategy to make ourselves safer in cyberspace. For a smaller group like us in an NGO, we have to pick our target. So we picked rail, the rail, air, and port systems over a 2-year period to study each one to make some legislative recommendations to help military mobility. We picked the cyber force issue, as I mentioned. Do we need we can talk about that in a minute, but there's a very complex argument over whether you need a seventh service, a dedicated cyber force. And then finally, we've decided to take a look at disinformation. Like, how can we more rapidly identify the bots that drive hate speech and cyber violence, online violence, inside social media applications? Because the government does an okay job of it around election cycles, but they don't see it as their day-to-day job. Even though it's a bad thing for our country, it's very divisive on both sides of the aisle. And so we're starting to take a look at kind of how bot farms work, how you can intervene earlier in bot farm development. So like right now we're watching we're watching a adversary's bot farm develop at a place just to kind of learn from it. And then eventually we'll turn in the information to get it disabled. But it's one of these interesting things. So that's how we target. I've got to pick my poison. I can't look at the 150 problems the US government probably has to look at major. I can look at 3. There's a couple other, there's not too many think tanks doing what we're doing, but there's probably a couple looking at 1 or 2. And, that's our job, is to kind of help the Congress by picking the one where we think we get the most return on investment, for looking at and then bringing legislation to the Congress, and then hope that the government's doing a good job tackling the vast majority of them. By the way, that hope has not been reflected in performance. I would say the government has been below average in how it tackles the cybersecurity impacts to our critical infrastructure.
Well, we knew that.
Hey, Admiral, Rick Stewart's asking a question about how much of the Chinese malware is from manufacturing processes versus penetration efforts.
So that's a great question. NSA isn't giving that level of detail, but I will tell you, it's reasonable to suspect that some of it's, baked in either the supply chain or the actual product. Some of it is, a lot of it, by the way, is it comes in patches. A patch is altered and the software is put in there. Now, often the vulnerability to be exploited by the malware that comes in the patch was put in the manufacturing process. but then you don't see the malware. It's seen as an anomaly and it passes through. Then during a patching, the actual malware comes in. So that's a sophisticated effort. Third, we sometimes see physical penetration, of a system, a human involvement, with a physical penetration and installation of malware. And then fourth, you see human, and this is the most common, particularly when it comes to criminal behavior. A malware is distributed through a phishing attempt by, taking advantage of poor human social interface, engineering interface, bad cyber hygiene, I guess, to shorten it, where someone takes the wrong action when offered a inappropriate document or link. So it's kind of across all four of those. The really sophisticated ones, though, I think, are the impurities installed during the production, but the malware comes in a patching thing, and it's just much harder for us to detect it. I tell you, the stuff that really worries me, we just put out a big policy memo on it, is in firmware. Now, this is the stuff that runs before you run your software, right? When you turn your computer, it's the booting, the things that bring up your server, your system, or whatever process you're running. If I can put the malware in there, the first thing it can do when everything starts to come online is say, do not look for the malware in me, right? Or this is ground truth with the malware in it, right? So we're really getting worried. This hasn't been, it's harder for criminals to use it. So we're not seeing it as in a lot of malware, but it's the way that the Russians took down Viasat. So definitely probably the most successful military cyber attack that we've had, which, forget that the Russians couldn't conduct large-scale maneuver warfare. Set that aside. I agree with that. In preparation of that, and forget that they only had like what appeared to be a 3 to 7 day war plan, so that after about 7 days they were out of cyber tools initially. The one tool they had ready to go, their number one tool, which they employed 6 hours before combat started, was a very effective takedown of Viasat, which took away the primary communication system for the Ukrainians, and only two things saved them. One, the rapid availability of a replacement system in Starlink, and two, the fact that the Ukrainians had become so disenchanted, the soldiers, with their Viasat systems, that almost all of them had excellent cell phone backups. And the Russians did not take out the cell phone systems for about cell phone towers in Ukraine. So, at the squad, platoon, company, battalion level, they were maneuvering through cell phone until the Starlink showed up. So, but to get back to my point, firmware was the attack path for that very successful thing. You don't even hear that. I imagine most of your groups hearing that for the first time listening to me. And, but I'm telling you, firmware, if you look on our website at www.fdd.org, if you look through there, you'll put in firmware, up will pop this policy memo. And I get it's boring, but it's a boring thing that ends with a very large vulnerability and no actual plan to fix it. That's the kind of boring I don't like.
Well, that's a great question, and you said this is really focused, sir, on the government military type things, but if it's critical infrastructure and such, obviously there's a second order effect, third order effect, a knock on that could affect the private industry folks out there. So I guess there is still risk out there to the private sector of that. How big of an issue do you see that?
So, Admiral, Victor is asking, was that Viasat or Biosat? Biostatistics?
Viasat.
Okay.
Viasat. There's like 40,000 terminals not 40,000 terminals. Yeah, 40,000 users on several thousand terminals in Ukraine. It was very directive. Like, we didn't lose Viasat on like I was still flying on my American Airlines flight, and Viasat does a lot of that. I was working just fine that day. I wasn't on a flight that day. If I had been able to work fine, it was a very targeted attack.
Okay.
Yeah. But Chuck, go ahead. Ask your question again.
Yeah. The question is really about. We understand that they're focused with the firmware and those kind of things on the critical infrastructure, the military, the government government applications. But what's the day-to-day risk of a second order effect, say, to the civilian sector, the private sector? Because you did mention that it was a very targeted attack.
Yep. So, well, look, for a couple of things. One, the number one problem affecting American businesses is not China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Although North Korea, which is effectively just a criminal cyber gang, like masquerading as a nation state. I just say one quick thing on North Korea because it's always funny. People don't get it. North Korea's total Western, USD, US dollars, Western currency budget, 50% of it is funded by cybercrime. In other words, all their sales to the West, their non-China sales, which are almost all barter, their non-Korea barter sales, everything that they sell overseas is equal to their cyber criminal behavior, cyber criminal extraction. That's a pretty impressive set of criminals. Now, the North Korean GDP is nothing to write home about. I would suggest that on a per capita basis, it's, in the 190s out of 198 countries, right? So they're not doing well. But what they do make money on is cybercrime. But getting back to the companies, the biggest thing threatening our companies are criminals. There's just no doubt about it. And right now, the biggest thing is ransomware. And, back when you were in the Marine Corps and I was in the Navy, there's that always joke, there's that joke, the beatings will continue until morale improves. Ransomware is going to continue until, people make the proper investments in cybersecurity. And that's going to be a long time. I've always thought to myself, if the GI Bill or the 529 for my kids ever tapped out and I really needed to make some money for college funds, ransomware would be a pretty easy way to do it. It is fairly easy. I heard recently that 90+% of ransomware events are initiated by a successful phishing attack. And, and so it's just basically getting the tools to conduct a phishing attack, locate a known non-zero day, but an unpatched known critical vulnerability on a system, which has already been mapped. So the ransomware as a service provider is telling you that for these companies, here's a known vulnerability that appears to be unpatched. They could be wrong, but their best guess from outside the network is it's unpatched. And then you're in there. I mean, you just have to decide you're a criminal, and then you're in the game. And so what I would tell you is this criminal activity is going to continue. We will not arrest our way out of this. Not that there's a lot of ransomware arrests anyway. Ransomware is, cyber crime is among the poorest, indictment conviction rates in the arrest, indictment, and conviction rates in the legal system. But it's going on, and right now the best you can hope for is that you're slightly more resilient than your neighbor, that they're taking a look at, and you're not the one exploited that day. That your neighbor, who was easier to get, they got into on a fewer number of phishing attempts, is the one that was exploited. So I say this in the context of we need to make serious investments. And people ask, well, what's that mean? A serious investment? I would say it's not a dollar number. It is a percentage of your IT budget that's in cybersecurity. Your IT budget is right. I promise you, if your company's functioning right, your IT budget's right. If your IT budget's wrong, eventually your company's failing. I don't have to, and your CFO makes sure of that. He or she's not being a jerk to the CIO if the CIO cannot provide the capability the rest of the company needs to function, right? Cybersecurity is different. The CISO, if you have one, comes up and he's arguing for money, saying this is against something you can't see that may not happen, and that becomes really problematic. So what's the right amount? If you're in a service heavy area, I would say between 10 and 14% of your IT budget should be cybersecurity. The big banks, 8 or 9 big banks, are in that 14% range. And to give you an idea what it is, that's $1 billion. It's more than $1 billion now at some of the banks, but there are 7 or 8 banks in America that spend more than $1 billion. And I'll just tell you, that's more than like I said, there's 198 countries in the world for these purposes. Like 100 of them don't spend $1 billion collectively on cybersecurity. And we got, JP Morgan's or Morgan Stanley spending that, right? My point on this is 10 to 14%. If you're in a heavy industry, it's probably in the 8 to 10%. Now, here's the problem. Instead of 10 to 14, our actual spending is about 8 to 10, 8 to 12, for those service areas. And for the manufacturing ones, instead of 8 to 10, it's 4 to 6. And that difference between 4 and say 8 in manufacturing that's the risk you're taking without good explanation. I promise you,
Hi, Dina.
As CEO or COO,
They're on it right now.
there's not a good explanation of that. To the
Just scary shit.
Mike, can you mute your mic? Mike?
There we go. Hey, so this is scary, right? That kind of Michael had it right, or Mike had it right there. But so my take is that if you're not making that investment, and look, I'm not at your company, and I don't do this for a living, and we're not allowed to here because we're a nonprofit. But you go and you take a look at at those. That's a question I would ask as a senior leader, and then I'd ask myself, so why aren't you getting that money? And I guarantee you're going to get this Trail of Tears discussion about how he's asked for that money or she's asked for that money every year, but the CFO has valiantly beat them to death, in the meeting before the meeting, in front of the CEO, where the CEO hears the CISO has grudgingly asked for 6% and is thrilled that they're getting 6%, when in fact the CEO is asking for 8 or 10%, the CSO. Or CISO. So my point on this is that kind of spending is going to be necessary to get at it. And the final thing I'll tell you is, if you're a small or medium-sized company and you don't have a CISO, you really have to look at a managed service provider. And I know, and I say that, and I don't recommend any specific one of them. I'll just say the chance that you can run it more efficiently than a managed service provider is 0 degrees Kelvin. Now, you could maybe run it better by just throwing money at it, but you can't run it more efficiently. And I've met very few companies that don't want to run things efficiently. So if you want to get the maximum return on investment, your cybersecurity dollar, you find yourself the right sized, the right position, the right level of innovation at a managed service provider who provides that for you and gets you in it. That's my 2 cents. And I say that no matter what audience I'm in front of. Chuck, that was my extended answer to your easy question.
Well, that was actually great, sir. You covered a lot of turf there, and I think, kind of without going back too far, one of the questions we had is your thoughts on the state of cybersecurity, just on a global perspective, and then the U.S. and Western partners. You went down to the tactical level, but as a whole, I don't want to back up too far, but just in general, it sounds like nobody's doing well at this in the security side.
Oh, no. I mean, there's people doing well. First of all, I did say the big banks were doing well. I mean, they're spending the money. Look, and they're under.
Yeah.
By the way, one thing I'll say right off the bat about big banks, I don't give them credit for this. They've known they were in combat in cyberspace for 35 years. Mm-hmm. They arrived at this through, it's like NATOP. Chuck, I can't remember if you were an aviator or not. You were, weren't you? Mm-hmm. Yes, they arrived at this the way you arrived at NATOPS, the Aviation, manual, blood, right? We say NATOPS is written in blood. Their cyber security strategies are written in failure, right? They had failures, they saw, they fixed, they remediated, they moved on. They ended up at that high percentage because that's where it turns out it is. They may have been at 60. By the way, some of them may have peaked a little higher and then brought it back down for efficiency, taking a little more risk, and ended around that 12 to 14% investment in cybersecurity. Okay. But it's like NATOPS. And so what I would say, for what I'd say for for us is, are there good companies? Yes, there's good MSPs out there. There's good there's companies that make the right investment. There are utilities. I have to say, like I studied water very carefully, and the water you drink, it comes 90% of us drink water that comes from a public utility. That's like your county or your state, usually your county or even a locality, provides the security around that water. But about 10% of America has privately run companies. Northern California, pretty famous for that, but a few other areas. I'll just tell you right now, having looked at the cybersecurity of each of them, the private companies are in much better shape. And there's two reasons for that. In their negotiations with the state, whatever locality they took over, they said, no, the rates, we get to raise rates when factors change. And we'll operate in a competitive process, but rates can change. So they can change rates when a new factor comes in, like cybersecurity starts to cost more, or there's a new rule on lead piping, lead abatement. The second thing is they're a private company. They can raise funds. They can raise capital. For your local utility to raise capital, they have to do something. They have to do a bond in an election, which first of all means it takes years to get on there. And then, like I worked water cybersecurity for a year writing a paper, as a side hustle for that, just kind of do it on my own here, talking to my wife about it every night. And then a water bond for cybersecurity comes up in Arlington, Virginia. And I ask her, how are you going to vote on it? She goes, I'm voting against it. I'm like, why? She goes, well, I don't want the extra taxes. And I'm like, I've been telling you for a year that we're getting attacked and our cybersecurity sucks. And you're still voting. And I had to sit there and argue her out of it. Needless to say, the bond failed, right? It was about 80-20 because I couldn't sit there and argue with 10,000 voters. But cybersecurity and your state locals. So when you ask me how are things doing, well, some private water companies are doing great because they're making the right investment. Mm-hmm. So are there companies doing good in cybersecurity? You bet. And they might even get hit with ransomware. That can happen. And by the way, if you're targeted, like your company is for some reason falls into the hackers, like, bore site or gun site, right? They could still get you. Anyone who tells you my security guarantees success, all they can do is say that I insure myself against your failure. That would be fine. But no one should tell you that. You should presume at a major system. I hope DoD assumes penetration of every NIPR system. Because I guarantee you there's penetration of every NIPR system, unclassified system. Now, what DoD should be running is tons of anomalous activity detection that says, I found you in here. I can honeypot you into something. I can kick you out. I can find you. I can find out that Chuck Taylor, Marine Colonel, should not be looking at Army, air defense designs. Mm-hmm. And when I see that file downloaded, an alert goes off and somebody finds out Chuck Taylor's on leave and somebody else is in his account right now, right? That kind of anomalous activity detection is what I expect to be running in every system. Because right. I should assume, you should try to block as much penetration as you can. Assume some, invest in finding it and defeating it. Mm-hmm. And then finally, build resilience and redundancy. What I mean by that is assume complete failure. How often are you replicating your system virtually so that you can rebuild rapidly once a professional removes the malicious thing, or once you get the key to unlock your ransomware? Whatever it is that you need to do. And if you are really need a level of resiliency, have duplicate systems running. These are the kind of things you sit down with your CISO or your managed service provider, whomever, to decide, what do I need to be successful? So Chuck, the answer is there are lots of successful companies, and I bet they're run by successful people. Mm-hmm. And there's lots of failures out there, or lots of companies running a lot of risk because they're run by people who are willing to take risk. I won't say only the one get hit with ransomware, because they both do, but I'll bet on one of them to recover more gracefully than the other.
Well, that's a great point, sir. And that's there's also, I think, I'd offer a third, and that is there are people who don't understand, there are leaders who don't understand the risk. So but I agree with you in the totality of it. There could be a third group out there that, in fact, that's part of why we wanted you on to do these kind of conversations, is to get the message out with folks that you need to understand the risk. You need to understand your network. You understand where you're, not just your IT side, but your security and how that integrates and such. And we always recommend people get audits, get those kind of things so they know what they've got, get the right pieces in place, get a professional team. Obviously, the large houses have their own capabilities, but it's really the small businesses we see at risk out here. And with that, I'd like to just go back to, we're starting to see some trends in cyber threat. We kind of talked through that, but what is your take on artificial intelligence, AI and machine learning in offense versus, the attack versus the defensive? Are you seeing, what are your kind of thoughts on that, sir? Because we hear a lot about AI.
Yeah. So first, you and I didn't know this, but we were working with AI, probably most of our military careers. We were certainly working with a lot of machine learning. I grew up on an Aegis weapon system. Aegis, it's a weapon system that controls like the spy radars and the air defense systems. I mean, when I was a junior officer, you could put that, back as the mid 80s till today, you can put that thing in auto, and you can set a doctrine, tell it what you're kind of thinking. It can assess the situation and take action. I will tell you, in my whole career, I never saw that system in auto on any ship I was on. I never heard of being in auto across 400 or 600 man years of ships that I knew of, where, intentionally put in auto, not in a test. My point on this is AI and ML have been around the military for decades. I think the DoD would tell you we've been working with AI since 1960. So mid 1960s. So what does AI mean? What it means is that AI is now evolving to the spot where it can be a benefit or a risk in your cybersecurity. I think, first of all, your job is to, as running a company, there's a whole part of the company. How does it make your company work better? I don't want to talk about that. That's not cybersecurity. And I'm confident that it's evolving in a way that will allow you to be more efficient. And I think, have less people doing more work. We'll see. It depends what you do in your company. I mean, if you run a janitorial service for large buildings, I think you're pretty locked in on the people you have. But there's other things where it could really be helpful. In cybersecurity, I do think it has the opportunity to, if we train tools right properly, we have the opportunity to have that thing I talked about, that anomalous activity detection, can run at a much faster rate. It can learn your network faster. It can learn Chuck faster, and Chuck gets fired and Scott gets hired. It learns Scott fast. It learns Mark fast. And it can much more quickly deduce inappropriate or unexpected behavior that is rapidly identified and remediated, right? That's kind of what you want in cybersecurity. So it could be really helpful. On the other hand, the ability of an adversary to map your network, understand your vulnerabilities, and exploit them also just, got exponentially faster. So what I'd say is, you should worry about artificial intelligence's risk to your systems. You should really worry if you're not investing in the defensive implications of it, right? But if you're investing in the defensive implications, I think you're in the same game that you're in right now. And by the way, you're generally getting your ass kicked right now. So this change might be good for you. So I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. So I try not to overreact to this. It's easy to overreact. And I believe, 9 panels out of 10 I do now have like a colon near the end of it that says, to include artificial intelligence, or whatever, whatever I'm going to speak on. It could be like, is there too much lead pipe paint, in your water piping, to include the impact of artificial intelligence? Like what, but I mean, that's literally what we deal with all the time.
Right. Well, I actually was aware that we were using AI machine learning when I ran offensive and defensive cyber teams. So it's, and one of the views with the Mantis 4 is we use machine learning on the front side and AI on the back side as well. So I know that a lot of the cybersecurity platforms are pulling that in. So that's a great. There's just an awful lot of, some of it's fluffy here out there, and some of it's, everybody's using the AI, as you said. It's kind of overstated for what people are actually doing today. So anyway, I'd like to ask, first of all, Scott, any questions from out there? Anything before I go into the next kind of the what do
I
you
don't
do
have
about it?
any questions right now from the group.
Okay,
I mean, if
anything
you've got
from
questions, put them in the chat and I'll ask the Admiral.
okay, we got a pretty good bunch, folks. So let me ask the next one if I can, sir. It's the kind of the what now. So what initiatives are the U.S. government leaning into that you see as most benefiting the small businesses in their cybersecurity efforts in kind of a near-term piece? I mean, obviously there's some really, some long-term initiatives out there, but what are we seeing out there that could hopefully help the small guys out here?
So, okay, I'm going to be, brutally frank here. I don't think the Congress or the executive branch sits up late at night worrying about the cybersecurity of the small guys. I'll be brutal here, right? Now there is a little bit, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. It's not just a freight train, right? There's a little bit of good news. I'm gonna start with the bad news. The government evaluates things like this. What are our systemically most important enterprises? What are the top 200, 300, 400 things that have to be working for the United States to go about kicking ass around the world, making a lot of money? These are big electrical power, the 7 or 8 big companies, the 6 or 7 rail companies, 10 or 12 strategic sea lift ports, 10 banks. There's company, and those things need a certain level of cooperation with the government. They need to have people who have SCI clearances. They need to be getting information rapidly, actionably, so you can do it. By the way, we're doing this poorly, but that is tier 1. Tier 2 are the utilities and the businesses that make up the rest of our national critical infrastructure, healthcare systems, water systems, the other, the next 1,000 big banks, all that kind of stuff. Then the next tier, and those people need slightly better cooperation with the government, speed of data. Maybe they don't need classified, but just information dumbed down as rapidly as possible and pushed to them. Then there's everyone else, the great unwashed, right? This is 40, 50,000 kind of medium to, more than 50 people, companies. They need information and they need guidance. They probably don't need information at the speed of data. They don't have someone sitting at a terminal, they can't invest in like an automated system that there's a threat to port 143 using this piece of software, block port 143. Well, they don't either have a human ready to do that, or they're not ready to invest in the automation to do that. And I get it. For those people, they need to be reasonably informed about things, taught how to do good cyber hygiene, and then where appropriate, helped financially with the kind of transition to better cybersecurity, with grant programs and things, or low interest loans. Because cybersecurity might not have been something you're thinking about. They showed up and said, you're running Windows 7 throughout your network. We got to get you off of that. It's going to cost $75,000. And you're like, well, my IT budget for this year was $75,000. My cybersecurity budget was $5,000. What do you mean I got to spend $75,000? You know what I mean? And then suddenly you're in this do loop. So, really what the government needs to be doing is have a lot of information exchange programs, data program, guidance programs, cyber hygiene programs for small businesses. And look, you've heard me say this already. The best thing the government can do is figure out how to make MSPs financially doable for your company. Help make sure there's a marketplace out there with a managed service provider that's at your level. In other words, not all managed service providers can handle all companies. Some companies are too big for what the MSP provides, and some are too small to afford what the lowest cost service they provide. But try to make sure there's a marketplace of MSPs to allow you to enter it. Because I'm going to tell you right now, the most efficient way to spend your 8 to 12% of your budget, depending what you do, your IT budget on cybersecurity, is to be doing it through an MSP. Now, this does not mean that you can, go back to your server, say, I'm running an MSP. I'm gonna go. I'm gonna start opening up like dating apps on my server here and hope that nobody penetrates. Is there? I am, whatever nasty habit you have. I'm gonna start doing online gambling here and hope nobody penetrates. Right? You have to still practice good cyber hygiene, and that's where they come in with advice like that. And your managed service provider should provide that. any good MSP doesn't tell you you're covered. What they tell you is you're covered here, but your workers have to do this, and you have to make sure they go to their training. You have to make sure everyone uses multi-factor authentication. Here's a shocker for you. The job most likely to not use multi-factor authentication, CEO, because I'm too important. I don't have the time. Let me just tell you, you are target set to, number one, your administrator, who I'm going to assume uses multi-factor authentication, could be a mistake. But number two is you, the leader, right? Because you're the person, who probably has the juiciest email, at least reputationally, that you do not want released, right? And so my gut reaction is that, getting yourself into a collective security environment while still managing your on-premises security at the highest possible level, which really means talking to your employees. Phishing is, well, one good thing about AI, I think we will be able to suss out phishing emails will both get better and the detection of them better. And since we're losing on the phishing email account now, I'll take AI being introduced to both. Like AI getting on the offense and defense is okay because we're getting our ass kicked, right? So let's get that in there. That's one good area. But my point on this is, that to me, and so I'm starting to say when they had a small business law we passed recently, small business cyber law. It basically said, try to make the company smart. I looked at that and said, I don't know what that's going to do for us. But I said, if you'd had a grant program at the end of it, that would have helped them. Sure. And there was some grant programs during the COVID recoveries and in the Infrastructure Act. There's some minor opportunities in there for you. And some states could use the state and local money they get for small business remediation. In other words, but that's really for helping you after stuff's gone wrong, right? The remediation there, that's recovery funds. But so from my perspective, it's get yourself into a shared environment. I'm down to just a third of a cup of Diet Coke, Chuck, and that means we're getting near the end.
We're working. You're doing well, sir. It's yeah.
So Admiral, I got a question from Victor. He said he's asking, is it true, as I've heard, that most large national actors, email covered up the question, most large national actors are well inside each other's power grids, leading to a mutually assured destruction scenario?
Partially. What I would say is I think Russia and China are inside ours, and we're working to beat them out now, finally. I think we have a better government, public-private partnership on that, and I think we're driving them out, but they're there. That's what today's testimony is about. Volt Typhoon, they list a lot of stuff. The one that should make you kind of go, ooh, is the power grid. Because an individual pipeline doesn't bother me too much. The power grid's the power grid, right? If I can disable 2 or 3 important points, we have a very integrated power grid. We're in 3 pieces of the United States, East, West, and Texas. And they're not equal, right? And despite what Texas people think, they're the smallest of the 3. But they are, there's the proverbial squirrel causes grounding in Cleveland, New York City loses power. That has happened. And I'll just say, 3 cyber attacks in Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and Buffalo, and New York City loses power for a long time, right? So that's where you're worried. Now, here's where it's not true. We're not in everybody's, because there's nothing to be in North Korea. There is no integrated power grid. You know what I mean? I'm not sure they have a power grid per se. If you watch that nighttime photography of the Korean Peninsula that Chuck and I used to look at all the time, South Korea looks like New York City, and North Korea looks like one dude with a flashlight, right? Pointed up, right? So, do I think we're in Russia? I suspect we are. I can't really talk about China just from my previous jobs, and neither can Chuck. But do I think we're in Iran? I hope so. I can talk about that because I'm never involved in it. But I just say, so do I think we're in them? Yes. It's not a mutual assured destruction, though. We're much more vulnerable. And what I mean by that is we are the big economic power. We're the one who's generating power. We need New York City to be power. I know this is hard for all of us to believe because New York City drives us crazy, But New York City, most of us who served 30, 40 years in the military know that our best national powers are economic power. I've yet to see a soldier get killed by economic power, by the implementation of it. I like sanctions. I like those things. And when you have to use the military, you do, but I prefer that. Those tools are all tied to servers and exchanges that have to be operating out of New York City. We're going to be able to sanction you to grab money through SWIFT and do all that stuff because everybody's up and running there. So we got to keep that going. And I think the adversaries understand that now. So I think in a real conflict, we'll be fighting to keep the Northeast power grid up. So it's an interesting look. There's some redundancy. I don't want to get into all of it, but it is not great redundancy. It's not the kind of redundancy that we'd accept as military officers. So or I'd accept. So I just anyway, that's a great question though. I don't think we're at mutual assured destruction, is what I would tell Victor.
Okay, Chuck.
Yeah, I think I have maybe one last question without going down too far, because you've talked a bit about what the businesses need to do, and obviously what government's doing out there. And of course, the good news is that we're on our own. The government says, hey, you guys go figure it out. The great unwashed. I like that term for, I'll accept that one. The question is really, what do we do about our vendors?
Kind of like the Marine Corps. That's my theory on the Marine Corps, Chuck.
I thought you were talking to, they used to call us that all the time on the shifts. I always took that as a compliment.
That was yeah. That was descriptive. Please keep going, Chuck. Yeah.
So no, how do we address our vendor supply chain risk with this? Because we've seen that as a direction of attack, kind of a vector.
Yeah. So listen, before AI, the big cyber acronym that had popped up for like 6 months with SBOM, software bill of materials. I think you really need to know, you really need to know the paternity and maternity, the kind of the line of your product, right? You need to know where it's coming from. You need to have an understanding of that. And you need to have an understanding of how secure were they, not just for nation state actors, but for criminals, right? You don't want to, if you're getting something from a mom and pop garage, that is a component that goes into something, you need to know that mom and pop garage has the right level of security around its product. Now, mom and pop garage is good for a military device, probably not great for a cyber device, but the idea is that you understand what's the lineage of this, what's the security in it, and that is it properly being penetration tested at each element, not just the integrating part penetration testing, because sometimes you can't see the flaw that's in an individual component, but are the components being penetration tested, at some kind of cute quality assurance level, and then is your product. And look, sometimes you can't afford that, but you need to know you're taking the risk. What I'd say is this is a risk on your secondary and tertiary supply chain. This is definitely where senior leaders are paid to take risk, right? This is something I cannot have fail. It's ubiquitous to every component I sell. I'm going to make sure its lineage is sat, that it is penetration tested at the beginning, at the middle, and at the end. I got it. This other part, it's in 5% of my things. If it turns out I made a bad bet, we're there. That's the risk I take. I'll eat it. I'll recover from it, and I won't make that mistake with that company again. So that's how I kind of take a look at it, Chuck.
All right.
I saw a question popped in there.
So I've got another question. This one's coming from Richard Wallenberger. Aren't most of the computers we buy, HP, Dell, Lenovo, built in China? Sounds like that is a concern.
Yes. They're not always assembled there. Sometimes they're assembled in other Southeast Asian countries with cheaper labor. I mean, China's getting killed by what they use to kill us. It's like, the movement in cheap labor. But certainly significant components of many of these computers are made there. Now, look, there's some other, it goes with network servers. I saw somebody put Cisco up. It goes with a lot of the software. That firmware I mentioned earlier, I think 30% of the world's firmware comes from Chinese companies. So on those ones, what you have to do is QA, penetration testing and quality assurance of a slightly higher number. There, you're not looking for defects or criminal activity. You're looking for the nation state. In other words, how much I penetration test something might be based on what's the risk there. It's being built in Australia. The risk is poor workmanship. Okay, it's being built in Indonesia. The risk is poor workmanship and criminal behavior. It's being built in China. It's poor workmanship, maybe not poor workmanship, but criminal behavior and nation state behavior. How I penetration test, what I see as an acceptable QA. Look, more and more though, you're seeing if you're working with the Department of Defense, we are working our way off of that in IT, and we're working our way towards US. Or I should be careful with that. I'm not for US shoring onshore. I'm for friend shoring. So US ally and partner, non-countries of concern is the terminology we use. Those, the products are having to come from there. And if you're working with the government, the nasty thing is you can count on us making you go deeper and deeper into the supply chain to make sure none of it's coming from China. And that's going to get painful, expensive. Painful.
Yeah. Robin Peterson is asking, do we work with high-risk clients now that will not allow any of our drones and made in countries other than U.S. made to fly on their sites?
Let's say that again.
We do work with high-risk clients.
Yeah.
That now will not allow any of our drones made in countries other than the U.S. made to fly on their sites.
So I've written quite a bit that I'm opposed to DJI and Autel drones being in our system. I just think it's too much risk. I would tell you, you're going to see more and more of that. So the American Security Drone Act just passed. We already had DJI and Chinese country of concern drones. Look, drones from a lot of countries are okay. Not China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, Myanmar, and
their
Cuba.
big one was China. So
Yeah,
thank you,
China.
Mark.
Yeah, China makes 90% of commercial, 87% of commercial drones.
That was my
Yeah.
issue, and I didn't know that I had to have a drone that was built in the U.S. to fly over their site.
And here's the problem.
Interesting.
The reason that DJI was appealing to you, as it should have been, was that it's probably 30% the cost of like a US like Skydio. But there's a reason for that, which is that the Chinese government underwrote DJI for 15 years while they developed it. You know what I mean? It's artificially low in cost. And here's, if you want to get really tricky, DJI gave a few very, 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 very low cost, almost free drones away to police departments. And magically, police departments like San Diego and Norfolk and Pensacola and San Angelo's out near Fort Hood, Fort Cavazos now. I mean, you could have just gone military, Navy base, Air Force, Army base, and of course those police chiefs are now up on Capitol Hill saying we need this free drone because the other ones are really expensive, and they're very, they're frustrated. I'm like, I'm sorry, man. That guy who's up here with you is actually a lobbyist for a Chinese company, and there's a reason that we really don't want drones that talk back to home flying over San Diego and Norfolk. Their side view very clearly showing ship movements and things like that. I mean, there's a real risk here. So I think you're going to see more and more. So my recommendation is, as you generationally shift, get off of DJI, make the investment as American commercial drones become available. But truthfully, there's a crap market. So the article I wrote said, we actually need to underwrite this. The government needs to help American state and localities and companies get off of Chinese drones. We can't just do it alone because the cost assigned to the drone was X, and the shift to non-Chinese drones is going to be 3X. So it's something we got to work on. I mean, there's some big energy companies that literally dumped 100,000, let me just say tens of thousands of Chinese drones just to get ahead of the game. And they just took the write-off that year. Great question. It really worries you. If you look my name up and drone, you'll find a lot on that.
So Rick Stewart is asking, as a manager of a software development company, I have looked through the offerings for checking our code for known issues. I want to make sure our devs are thinking about cybersecurity as a code. Most of the offerings I see have a fairly decent cost to getting into. just to see if they work for us. You previously said you will not recommend any certain company for cyber tech. Do you know of any place I can look for a curated list of top options for checking our code before it is released? I am not seeing anything on CISA website about this niche market.
Yeah, I don't. Chuck, if you could, after this, connect me and then give me that question written out, I will go, I'll send it to someone who could answer that question.
Sure. And
by the way, I would have said CISA, so I would have been wrong. So I'm glad you took that right off the table. But I'll talk to some friends in government and see if I can't get you an answer. The answer might be there is no answer, sadly, despite whatever you pay in taxes. But I'm going to hope that there is an answer. So Chuck, if you could take that for action, I'll do that.
Absolutely. We'll pull that around, and I'll ask Chris Dudunsky, you're on by chance, and Scott, you guys actually may have somebody that I'll let you guys look at that too, if you.
Well, I can take a look at it. We don't do it very often, though. It's not a request that we have too often.
Okay.
Yeah. Same with us. I wouldn't know what our developers are using, so it's something that I would have to get with him.
It is an interesting question, though, because there was conversation about security baked into the coding, that there was a lot of policy talk about that a few months ago, not 6 months ago or a year, and it seems to have gone quiet. You'd think if people are saying, Microsoft and everywhere else, you have to have the QA in before, we can't be continuing patching, we want to get left of that. We got to have a perfect product before it comes out, which we know would be prohibitively expensive. You would think that somebody would actually look at this very question and say, how do we get there? So
yeah. So there's some follow-ups here. Richard Wallenberger is asking if we could please share the answer with all of us in attendance.
Yeah, sure.
Rick Stewart is saying, I really appreciate a follow-up to this. Thank you. We are looking into purchasing soon. And then Lisa is saying, yes, I would like an answer to this as well.
I think if you send it to the Chinese embassy, they'll give you a free check, but that may not be the one you want. All right. That's good. Thanks. Any other questions, Scott, in the queue?
No, sir.
Can I give you a couple of thoughts? Is that all right?
Yep, that's what I'm
absolutely.
looking for.
Yeah, I want to say thanks. For people who don't know Colonel Taylor, he's a great American, and I would jump on almost anything and not a grenade, but anything short of that for Chuck. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all. My take is if you're listening to this kind of thing, you're probably in the right. You're already thinking right. You're probably 50% of the way down the track. The real question is, are you doing the risk assessment versus cybersecurity really is a risk game. You're going to lose once in a while. Your goal is to invest enough to make the losses completely acceptable, and that you've also done that special investment in resilience and redundancy to recover rapidly, because that's what you can't afford. What you can't afford, small. I'm not saying all your businesses here, but many small and medium-sized businesses operate on a 4 to 10 week float, somewhere in there, and a ransomware event that goes wrong. In other words, one where you're waiting for the key for 2 weeks and then doing 2 weeks of system recovery could easily cost you 4 weeks. For a lot of companies, that's the difference between success and failure. We're seeing that. We're seeing that now. Look, utilities, that doesn't happen to because eventually the county bails them out. But for small, medium-sized businesses, small businesses, you're really on your own. Mm-hmm. So you've got to invest enough to knock down the risks to something you can take, and that's about the day-to-day. And then for the really bad news, you've got to have the right amount of resilience. You got to decide: is my float? Do I need to be operational within 3 or 4 weeks, really efficient, and not 8 weeks? And therefore, I need to be investing in that redundant system that I may never use. It'll be wasted money if I'm never really taken down. But it'll be the difference between having a company, not having a company. if I'd made that investment and I really get hit hard. So those are the two choices you got to make: the day-to-day and the resilience, redundancy. Once you've made those two choices, if you're running your company right, you never, you just go through it. You just follow the personal cyber hygiene rules, all that, you'll be okay. Chuck, that's kind of how I look at things, but I really appreciate the chance to talk with you all, and those are great questions.
I go, Scott.
Yeah. When I do security risk assessments, the first question I ask my customer is, what's your tolerance for downtime?
Yep.
Because then that gives me a guideline of what their expectation is and where I need to go to help manage and mitigate those risks.
I love that, Scott. And I'd almost say, like, and describe your downtime to me.
Mhm.
Because let me describe, and then let me bring you two cases from related industries of what downtime was to them.
Yeah.
And now tell me again your tolerance for it, and then you kind of settle at the right thing. Scott, that's the perfect. I love that you asked that.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, Chuck,
thank you.
All right, so hey, I just want to say thank you to all the participant audience that showed up. Great questions. I'm gonna just quick follow up here. We'll circle back with hopefully a pretty good answer to the question on the QA piece out there for coding, and we will also follow up with some links. There will be once there is a video I hope that we've got captured. We'll get cleaned up. We'll send a link to this webinar video out as well. You can certainly share that. We'll send some other information out. Scott will be sending that out from his side, from the Winning Technologies team. Don't block those guys. Check your spam boxes and stuff. He's not just going to spam you. He'll send the stuff out. And with that, I do want to say thank you, Admiral. Again, always a pleasure. Very insightful. And Scott, you can say I was right when I said if we just get Admiral Montgomery on here, it's like 4 questions, okay? And he's just going to run with this thing, and then he's going to say, "Time, I've got to go back to work."
Yeah,
All right.
yeah. No, it was a pleasure to meet you, Admiral.
Yep. You too, Scott. Thanks, guys. Chuck, I'll see you around the block. All right.
All right.
Okay.
Take care, sir. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everybody.